Oh, Good evening, Dr. Redfield. Thank you very much for making this possible to talk to our parents. I'm Joe Duttweiler. I'm the principal here at Immaculate Conception School in East Aurora. So again, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank Michael Caputo. He's the one who arranged it.
Yes, I did earlier when he logged on. So I do want to thank Mr. Caputo, and the other parents are aware of that as well. So thank you very much. I do have one question to start, Dr. Redfield. There seems to be a lot of controversy about if the students are seated at their desks and they are 6 feet apart, are they allowed to take their masks off? What's the policy on that?
Well, you all would develop the policy. Our own recommendations would be that probably the most important thing that the school can do is to support wearing face coverings, masks. That's really going to be the key, more than the 6 feet. You know, we always say it's 6 feet when and if you can't maintain 6 feet, wear a mask. But if you really want to put that in perspective, it's really the face covering that we have strong evidence really can interrupt transmission, particularly from source control. That is, the individual that's wearing the mask, by wearing the mask, make it less able for them to pass the virus if they have it. There is also some protection, but it's not anything compared to the public health benefit we get from source control. So you have that individual who may be asymptomatically infected, they're 6 feet away, they don't have a mask, they sneeze, they cough, they raise their hand and speak loud. You can get substantial droplets. So I would say the most important thing is to wear the face covering. If people want periods of time to get the face covering off, you know, spread out in the cafeteria or the gymnasium or outside. But I do think universal using of these face coverings are going to be probably the most important thing that schools do.
Okay, thank you very much. What about, is it more likely to catch the COVID from contact with another person, or like touching a surface that, because we're very busy sanitizing everything and we'll continue to do so. But I did hear too that the touching something that was infected wasn't as a greater risk to someone carrying the virus.
Yeah, very important question, Principal. That we do know that we can get what we call fomite transmission, that is transmission from surfaces. And depending on the surface, this virus will have different periods of time. And depending on the environment, whether it's warm, cold, whether there's UV light. But the real risk of transmission, the major way of transmission, is we call droplet transmission. And, you know, people don't realize, I mean, you have some people who talk at you and you can feel their oral spray in your face. But the truth is, most people, when they talk, generate tons of droplets. And so that's the real risk. Now, how do I defend, and how do the students defend, and how do you and the teachers defend against fomite transmission? Yes, you're going to do your disinfections like you're doing. But the most important way we defend against it is we wash our hands, right? The only way fomite transmission is going to cause infection for me is if I happen to move my hands around infectious surfaces and then I don't wash my hands and then I start rubbing those hands into my face. So this is why we advise frequent hand washing. You have hand sanitizers, and we really try to tell people, don't start rubbing your nose or rubbing your face. So the major transmission is this droplet transmission. So the mask, and the other thing that schools can do, and I see it behind you, is, you know, have good ventilation, opening windows. We put out some new guidance to help schools, again, look at things that they can do to increase the aeration in the room, because this virus doesn't like distance, and it doesn't like a lot of movement of air. And this is why, you know, when you look at gatherings that are inside, they're higher risk than gatherings outside. You know, so if you have decent fall weather, sometimes a lot of schools are looking at having certain activities outside that they otherwise might have had inside, because it's all about relative risk. But I really do believe if we wear those masks, we're smart about hand washing, we don't overcrowd, that, you know, we're going to get back to having schools open face to face in a very effective and safe and sensible way.
Well, so thank you.
And by the way, that word safe and sensible, I attribute that to Dr. Michael Caputo. He's been very big in reminding me to tell people that it's all about opening schools, but in a safe and sensible way.
Does anyone have any questions for a doctor? Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask away.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about viral load, and from a statistical analysis, it seems like that if you just happen to, you know, you're walking down the street or running down the street and pass by someone who is positive and perhaps emitting, that's not really a danger to you, because the level of disease or virus that you might get from that extremely brief interaction cannot infect you. Can you comment on that?
It's a good question. You know, we're learning more about this virus all the time. As you know, I'm a virologist by training, and I just got introduced to it about 8 months ago. The truth is, this virus is very different than a lot of the respiratory viruses that we've had to deal with before. And in a sense, some of the characteristics took us all by surprise. You know, first, we've learned actually that a lot of people are asymptomatic as opposed to flu, for example. Second thing we learned, there's a lot of virus replication that occurs when you're pre-symptomatic. Actually, the most virus replication, the highest virus that an individual has is usually the 24 to 40 hours before they actually feel symptoms. And again, that's the same for people who don't get symptoms whenever they initially get infected. So it really is dependent on how much virus. This virus replicates well in an individual, but then after 2, 3, 4, 5 days, it really doesn't. So I think it's more about how much virus the individual has and whether that individual produces significant droplets that have the ability then to get to you in an effective way. If you have a barrier on, it's going to block it. If you don't, it can get you in a more effective way. It's going to be sort of random how much virus, how much space it has to traverse, how close you are. I wouldn't try to suggest that if you're symptomatic, you're more likely to transmit than an asymptomatic. If you're kind of with them for a couple, you know, they cough and you're with them for in their area for a minute, that might be less than if they don't cough and they're with you for 5 minutes. So I think it really, unfortunately, is about how much virus there is and how susceptible you've allowed yourself to be. That's why I've told over and over, we're not defenseless. We have a powerful tool. It's at our hands. Do it. It's to wear a face covering or face mask. It's to social distance. Be smart about it. It's to wash our hands and be smart about how we crowd ourselves around other people. If we do all those things, I don't know if you saw the recent report that we put out from Rhode Island, but I think it was a reassuring report. Rhode Island had shut down all of their daycare centers, and they decided to eventually open their daycare centers. And the public health community provided leadership with all of the centers and what they needed to do and how to do this safely. They wanted staff to be wearing masks. They wanted to have disinfection, smartness about ventilation. These are daycare centers. 666 daycare centers, almost 19 to 20,000 kids. And what they found is, after they were open for 1 to 3 months, is they found 29 cases of COVID out of over 19,000 kids. 20 of those daycare centers only had a single case. 9 of them had more than one case. Only 4 of those daycare centers and 4 of the 666 daycare centers led to a secondary case. In other words, if they practice these public health procedures of the staff, the kids didn't wear face masks even. Some of them were 2 years old, younger. But the staff, they used the hygiene that we talked about, disinfection. So it really does mean, if we're vigilant, within reason, that I think schools are going to be able to really limit transmission. The other important thing I want to say for the parents is, the reality is, when we see cases in schools right now, those cases occur in the schools, not in the schools. These are kids who got infected in the community. So again, it's the community acquisition that really is the driver of transmission. We're prepared to work with any school district when they do have cases to be able to help. We can sequence the viruses and we can actually show whether there really is intra-school transmission, or, as we've seen to date, most of the transmission that we're seeing is actually kids that got infected in the community. So I don't know if that answers your question, but daycare program in Rhode Island was, for us, was really a great example of 666 schools deciding to follow the public health advice of the state of Rhode Island. And the Rhode Island group decided to monitor to see how things went. And at the end of the day, I think a lot of people were surprised. 29 cases and over 19,000 kids that were daycare kids, where they didn't have the added advantage of having all those kids masked, and that they didn't see significant secondary transmission. 4 cases. I think it's remarkable. And again, I think it's an important counterbalance for people that are paralytic about getting our schools back open.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else has a question? Go ahead.
I have a question. Is there any reason to believe that the virus, and thank you again for agreeing to speak with us, we appreciate that. But is there any reason to believe that the virus is getting stronger or weaker or remaining the same?
You know, is it Therese?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know. That's what the computer says. I just was wondering what your name was, but it's a great question. And it is interesting that this virus has changed. When the virus first came in from China, you know, we diagnosed our first case, I think, January 21st, January 22nd, in the state of Washington, in the Seattle area. And over the next 5-6 weeks, looking pretty hard, we diagnosed 12 more cases. And of those 12 cases, we identified over 850 contacts that were at risk. And following our standard public health approach, we, CDC, and the public health departments evaluated all 850. And we only identified 2 people that were also infected out of the original 12 cases. And they were both spouses married to index cases that came back from Wuhan, China. In a sense, that gave us a little bit of a false sense of that this virus was like other coronaviruses. It wasn't that transmissible, because we had some people that had a lot of contact and in close contact and non-mitigated contact, and yet there was no transmission. Then the virus came in from Europe. And I've done a lot of work on the West Coast, and even though some of the press wants to say differently, I can tell you we have 5 very strong lines of evidence that this virus was not circulating to any extent in the United States in January and February. It started in late February and March to really circulate, and that was largely driven partially by virus coming in from Europe. Now, it's the same virus from China that went into Europe, but when it went into Europe, it did change. And so, without going into too much detail, the amino acid sequence of this virus did change, and one of the consequences of that change, that virus is much more infectious. Right? So there is some change in terms of infectiousness. We don't have any evidence that the virus has changed in terms of pathogenicity and how it causes disease, how severe it is. You know, it doesn't mean that it doesn't do that. We just don't have any evidence to prove that. We do have evidence that the virus has changed and become more infectious by this amino acid sequence change. And of course, that's the virus that's basically been circulating in the East Coast and now is actually dominating throughout the country. It's also the virus now that's dominating throughout the world. As you can see, a virus that becomes more infectious has a selective advantage of dominating. So it's a great question. You know, this virus, all viruses try to evolve, and I don't want to give them a mind, but I have a lot of respect for them. They evolve because the only way a virus can survive and reproduce itself is through a host. It's a parasite. It won't survive if it kills its host. So most viruses do attenuate in their ability to kill the host. The problem is you don't know the time course of that attenuation. You know, it may be 5 years, it may be 10 years, it may be 100 years, it may be, but this virus clearly has an amino acid sequence change that has promoted greater infectivity when the virus came in from Europe.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I just have one. I'm just curious, what are your hopes for a vaccine? Or when possibly, do you think we could possibly have a vaccine for this?
I think it's really a great story. I've been in vaccine development most of my professional career, all the way back to the 1980s, multiple vaccines. That's kind of where my research interest lied. I think the decisive decision that President Trump made in starting this thing called Operation Warp Speed, I think a lot of people were skeptical. But it's become one of the most decisive private-public partnerships that I've ever seen. I'm on the board, so I see it every day. But we now, as of this week, have 3 vaccines already in phase 3 trials. All right, we're the fastest we've ever had a vaccine from the time we tried to develop a vaccine was 2 years. The average is 6 to 8 years. Right? We have 3 vaccines in phase 3 trials. I'm relatively confident that we'll have 1 or more vaccines approved, by at least by an emergency authorization before the first of the year, which is really unbelievable. I mean, you know, for those of us with faith, which I am, it's almost a miracle. I mean, that we could actually put together the private-public partnership that we've done. And these are, again, I want the American public to know, and your listeners to know, in doing this, we're not cutting corners scientifically. We're not even cutting corners with safety and efficacy. Those trials are going on. what the corner we cut was the finances of this. Normally what happens is you do a phase 1 trial, then you do a phase 2 trial, then you do a phase 3 trial, a lot of people to see if it works. Frequently, the FDA requires a second phase 3 trial. And then once the FDA tells you it works, the company then goes back and figures out how it's going to manufacture it so they can basically sell it. So that usually takes another year or so. What was done here was when the company was ready to go into phase 3 trials, the United States government entered a contract with the company to start manufacturing the vaccine. Currently, we're manufacturing vaccine for 3 major vaccines right now, with the idea they'll deliver 100 million doses. So that if, and it's an if, the FDA reviews the data in October or November of their trials that are ongoing right now, and the first 2 groups, Pfizer and Moderna, have already enrolled more than 50% of the volunteers. Pretty sure that by early October, that trial will be totally enrolled. Both of them. AstraZeneca just started over the weekend. Their enrollment will be done sometime in the middle of. So it's very likely that we'll have enough data by November, sometime during November, to be able to determine if this vaccine works or not, or one of these 3 vaccines work. And when that's determined, we don't have to wait for the vaccine. We've already started manufacturing. They're manufacturing right now. At the end of the day, we may end up with a lot of souvenirs. The vaccine doesn't work, but we really are. I'm extremely optimistic. And people can criticize all they want, but the decisiveness to do this private-public partnership, basically buy vaccine at risk. And so far, we have bought 3. We have 6 major vaccines that are what we call shots on goal, 3 of which are already at the phase 3 trials now. Next month, I expect 2 more to be ready for the phase 3 trial. And I think it's very probable we'll have a vaccine. That said, I want to remind people that vaccines don't work in everybody. But what does work, I think, in everybody is a face covering, social distancing, washing your hands, being smart about crowds. And what I would really ask you for the Thanksgiving of the time that I spent with you tonight, I'd ask only one thing. All really seriously consider embracing the flu vaccine this year for yourself, your family, for your community, for your colleagues, because many people underestimate flu. Many people don't know 360,000 people died of flu in the last decade. The first year I was CDC director, 80,000 Americans died of flu. Very frustrating to me when I know we have a flu vaccine and less than 47% of Americans took advantage of it. And this virus killed 80,000 people, killed more children in the first year I was CDC director than any year in the history of the country. And yet we had a vaccine. So I think it's so important to embrace vaccination for what it is. It's one of the most important gifts. I believe it's a gift of science. I believe science is a gift of God, and that we have it for flu. And I think soon, somewhere between the end of October and the end of December, we're going to have 1 or more vaccines for COVID.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else with a question?
Yes, thank you. I just have a quick question. As our kids are going back to school and back to daycare, I understand that kids under 2 are not wearing masks, and I understand why. And I was just wanted to compare that with our kids who will be going back to school, and we're going to be trying to social distance them at least 6 feet, and they have much better hygiene and much less oral spray than these kids in this that I feel like are a little bit compromised under 2 years old with sharing. I was just wondering if there's currently any age groups that you're seeing with more COVID cases in regards to that. with these?
Yeah, it's an interesting question as we gather more and more. It is interesting that overall, I think uh, we'll see the exact prevalence as more kids are getting exposed. Clearly, this virus seems to attack more individuals between the age of 15 and 30. That's where we're seeing all the action. I think largely because they're putting themselves at higher risk exposure. I think it's important for parents to understand that this virus, in terms of its pathogenicity for children, is much more benign than, say, for adults. So if you look at the mortality among people under the age of 18 for COVID up to now, it's basically around less than one. So basically, if you look at it, we're looking at maybe 0.2 per 100,000. So, you're really looking at a very limited number. It's less than, really less than 1 in a million would have a severe reaction. That doesn't mean kids can't get sick. They can. That doesn't mean there's not a unique syndrome that you've all read about in the newspaper that is very rare, thanks be to God, but it can cause a hyper-inflammatory response and can be quite significant for children. But in general, children are asymptomatic, and if they do get infected, they develop significant illness that requires hospitalization. And as I said, mortality is really in the range of 1 in a million. And that's very different because at the same time, over the last 5 years, we've shown the mortality for flu for kids 0 to 18 was more in the range 6 to 13 times higher than COVID. And this is, again, why I ask people, please vaccinate your children against flu. Because while the flu vaccine may not keep your children from getting flu, it keeps your children from dying from flu. And I think it's really important to do that. But I do think when you hear stuff, well, some people will say children transmit, or I wouldn't buy into that. I think children can get infected. I think children can transmit. I think it is going to be interesting as we look at the difference of acquisition of COVID among children that are in school that are under the age of face coverings versus over the age of face coverings, control for other factors. I think it's also going to be very interesting. School districts that chose to do teleschool, so they stay at home in their community versus face-to-face. I have my own hypothesis that actually we're going to show that kids that stay at home in their community, I believe, are probably going to have a higher rate of infection. Children that go into schools that are reopening in a safe and sensible way. That's, I met with the head of Delta Airlines recently, and Ed and I were talking about the airlines and the safety of flying. And I do think it's very safe to fly. My wife thinks every plane's a brand new plane. Now it's on it, but it's not really brand new, but it's really unbelievably clean. New HEPA filter systems in them, and the air you've not smelled air that clean. But about 40,000 of his employees were given the opportunity, took the opportunity not to work, but to go home without pay while we're going through this crisis. And about 60,000 continued to work. The infection rate of the employees that decided not to work is significantly higher than the infection rate of the employees that stayed on working on airplanes. So I do think that it is going to be interesting to look at the relative acquisition of children under different circumstances. We come back to that Rhode Island study that I think should provide some sense of support to family members that might be concerned. What about kids that are in daycares that don't have a mask? Rhode Island was really able to show that they could put over 19,000 kids into school and have 29 infections. I think it really does show you what can be done, and not for us to be fanatic The 2-year-old has to have a mask. Now, obviously, there has to be thoughtfulness about distancing. And again, I do think it's important, and I wish I had data to show you specifically so I could be more definitive. We've always said it's 6 feet. If social distance 6 feet, and if you can't 6 feet, wear a mask. So I do think it's important to realize there's nothing magic about 6 feet in school where you're wearing masks. This is why the American Pediatrics Academy came out and recommended, the association recommended that 3 feet. So I'm trying to encourage schools, wear masks and be thoughtful about social distancing. At least space individuals, I think, with masks 3 feet. 6 feet if you're going to not wear a mask, although I'm going to tell you, please, I think it's just safer to wear a mask. If you're going to have mask-free environments, do that outside. Let people be spaced. Do it in the gymnasium. Let people be spaced. If you have a cafeteria and you want to do it, fine, but space. So those are some thoughts, Ash.
Okay, anyone else with another question?
I have a question about symptoms. And first, I just want to say thank you so much for being here with us. We really appreciate it. I'm just wondering if you could talk about the symptoms that we should look for in our kids and maybe like a hierarchy of them. I've heard that the fever is the most telling sign. Then it was, no, it's not the fever. It's the loss of smell and taste. So just if you could talk to that a little bit, I would appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think probably the most common reality for individuals under the age of 20 is no symptoms. That's what makes it such a challenge. Now we're about to come into flu season. I can tell you if you get flu, there's symptoms. So as we get into flu season, particularly for kids, if they're not vaccinated, if you see somebody that's symptomatic, it's going to be much more problematic they have flu than COVID. For children, it really is largely asymptomatic. Then you get into the very non-specific. Now, fever is relatively, particularly under 18 and under 20, is relatively unusual. If you say a fever, say, greater than 100.5, it's unusual. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It happens a lot more in adults. You did say correctly that really one of the signs and symptoms that really, if you have it, you have probably a 75-80% chance of actually having your COVID test come back positive, is if you lose your sense of taste and smell. And none of us quite know why, but it is very unique to this COVID virus. So when I hear somebody lost their taste or smell, I'm pretty confident they have COVID. The others are very nonspecific, stuffy nose, sore throat, cough, aches and pains. So unfortunately, there's nothing really to help a parent. That's why we really came up with the recommendations that we finally came up with, is that, when you're having active transmission in the community, all of us should assume we're infected. And we should do the socially responsible, and that is to wear face covering so we don't infect somebody else. As you get older, once you get over the age of 45, if you get into the age 50 and older, then the symptoms are much, 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 much more common. Fever, cough, respiratory symptoms, shortness of breath, stuffy nose. But the only thing, Nikira, that is really, I think, specific for COVID to the degree that has any specificity is the loss of taste and smell.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, anyone else? Any questions?
Could you potentially comment on if you've had it and recovered your resistance to it and any time periods?
That's a great question. I think in general, and we've seen there's so many more have really been infected than those being diagnosed. We did a study and we published it in one of the major journals, and when we March, April, and May, where we had about 2 million cases with serology to see how many people had antibody to the virus. It was one, so it means back in May there was only over 20 million Americans that had already been infected. So we estimate now that we're probably north of 60 million Americans have been infected. And in your area, New York, of course, New York City in particular, we had, an 20% of the population had antibody when we looked at them. And then the question is, well, what does that antibody mean? And we have very good data in animals, which makes us optimistic about vaccines, that when individuals have recovered and they have antibodies, animals that is, when we try to infect them, we're not successful. So again, for some period of time, so that there is this concept of immunity. That's why we're pushing so hard for the vaccine. Now that immunity, we don't know how long it lasts. Part of the stuff we're trying to learn right now is called the immune correlate to protection. So what is that immune response that you need to have to be protected? And you saw in the recent news, both in Hong Kong and now here, there's been several cases that have been reported that they got infected a second time. And we're pretty confident that that's real. They really did get infected a second time. We sequenced their virus. I don't mean we, the scientific community, and we know that they had one virus at one moment, which was a virus at that moment, and then they have another virus at another moment, which is common. And so they actually did get infected probably twice. And then trying to understand what was their immune response, what had changed. And I will give the caveat that any immune response can be overwhelmed depending on how much virus you get exposed to. I do think in general, antibody means that you're going to be protected for some period of time. What we're waiting to be able to tell everybody, if you have this much antibody that has of this quality and this type of antibody, not all antibody is the same. If you have this type of antibody and you have this much of that antibody, you're protected. And when that antibody falls down, then you're at risk. This is no different than what we measure for some vaccines where we vaccinate you. We measure to see what's happened to the antibody. If the antibody falls down to a certain level, then we say it's be revaccinated. Now, a lot of times we just do that automatically, hey, every 5 years, because we know how the antibody falls in a population. But for example, hepatitis B is a certain antibody threshold that we want you to have. And if it falls below that, we want you to get boosted up because there's evidence that you're at risk for reinfection. I think all of those answers are going to come out in the next 24 months. It's going to be, I think, great. I think we'll have a vaccine. We'll be able to give it to people. We'll be able to do blood tests to people to tell them you don't need the vaccine right now, but we can monitor you and say, whoops, now it's time that you need the vaccine. I do think this virus is going to be with us, for the duration. It's not going to go anywhere, not going to disappear. Respiratory viruses are very difficult to extinguish, but I do think we're going to have what I call biological countermeasures, the vaccine, to be able to induce antibody that's going to be able to protect people. The most important thing, and you all are in a community, and the most important thing about the entire discussion and schools, the highlight is, the risk is not so much to the children, but it's to protect the vulnerable. This virus has, for whatever reason, and we don't understand, really seems to have a spectrum from causing no illness in majority of us under the age of 45 to basically being quite problematic to those of us that get over 70. And those of us between 45 and 70, depending on how many comorbidities of heart disease, kidney disease, diabetes, obesity, pulmonary disease that we have, I tell people that the long-term care facilities make up 0.1% of all the people in our nation. So 0.1%, 1 in 1,000. And yet they make up almost 50% of all the people that have died. So again, as you look in your own community, it's so important, whether it's your teachers, your principals, your parents, your grandparents, that we do have vigilance about protecting the vulnerable. And that's why using the mask, washing the hands, keeping social distance, being smart about gatherings. And again, I would argue, please get the flu vaccine, because flu also can cause significant mortality to our vulnerable individuals that are elderly.
Someone else?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask a question. Doc, you were saying today, when we were in my office, that we're starting to get more and more data about kids, and that we can't be so certain that they don't get it and they don't spread it. I'd like to know how we've learned that recently. Actually, I meant to ask you when you were here, because that's interesting news. And secondly, I know you're a man of great faith, and that you're very devout Catholic, and we have a lot of talks about that here in Washington while we're going through this whole COVID thing together. What do you think this pandemic, what does it mean to you as someone who is so close to the Catholic Church, and how do you handle this?
The first question, we have more and more data, particularly now that kids are going back to school, people are looking, we're doing more investigations. We've done a lot more testing of kids. And we do know, as I said, if you look at kids, even as you get from 10 years of age to 20 years of age, significant group of kids have antibody to this virus. And then when we test for actual antigen in different groups are positive. And of course, the highest group, if you get in that age group, somewhere around 20 to 30, 18 to 30, 15 to 30, that's the highest group in almost every single jurisdiction that we look at right now. So this virus clearly infects kids. We also have good studies now, some that will be coming out, where we've had, say, a kid that was in a congregate camp type setting, where there were some cases, recommendations were made to self-isolate for 14 days. The family decided, hey, they had a great reunion plan. He looked well, he didn't have any symptoms after 4 or 5 days. They decided, heck, let's go to the reunion. They went to the reunion, and in a matter of a week or so, 13 of the family members were infected. One of them was in the hospital. And the kid obviously became infected and caused quite a significant outbreak in that family. I try to tell people we also have good data now where we've actually measured the amount of virus that is present in children that are infected compared to the adults, and it's basically the same or greater. We've also looked at the amount of virus that's in the oropharyngeal cavity and quantitated the kids that are asymptomatic versus people that are symptomatic, and it's the same or greater. So I think the science is there, and I get very disappointed when I hear people kind of say definitively that children are a source of transmission. I think we should just be humble and open-minded as we get more data, but it's very likely that children could be. Now, I will say that it's also likely to me that asymptomatic individuals in general are more risk than symptomatic individuals. Symptomatic individuals have learned if you're sick, you shouldn't be out in public right now. So they actually may be the asymptomatic individuals are at greater risk for transmission, but that risk is minimized enormously if they just follow the recommendations and the weapons that we gave them. Wear a mask, social distance, wash your hands, and be smart about crowds. And I think we can negate this. The second, you know, Michael, it's been, my faith is so important to me. I think, you know, I have confidence that through crisis, opportunity has. I remember when I had a large program, I actually wrote one of the largest grants for the American Catholic Church to help treat AIDS around the world. We ultimately treated over 750,000 people, multiple countries. And it was great to see the Catholic Church get more engaged in treatment. One of my countries was, I was in Europe at the time on the phone with my team. All of a sudden the phone went dead at, I think, 4:51 or 4:52 in January. And of course, that was the earthquake. And I was able to come home and pack my bag. Very interestingly, my wife was sent off to Haiti in a major earthquake. I had a duffel bag, and when I opened it up when I was in Haiti, thinking that I had like peanut butter and stuff to eat, I had a bag of rosaries. Wanted me to distribute to people. But I went there, and it was catastrophic. Over 300,000 people lost their lives. And those of you can't even imagine what it was like to stand there on the hills of Haiti and listen to wailing, because the children, the parents that had money were working, that had jobs, were working in the city, but their children were home because the children of the people paid tuition went in the morning. The parents that were poor were at home in their cardboard houses, but their children were in schools in the concrete structures. The children of the poor all died. The parents of the people who had jobs all died. And that whole city wailed. And it really did wail. And you have to wonder, my friends use that as an example, that there must not be a God, or that God was vengeful. And my faith tells me God allowed it to happen because something greater is going to come from it. I don't quite see that, but I believe that. This outbreak is tragic, but I have to believe at the end of the day that we'll be better as a world as we get through it. I'm a firm believer that science, which I'm a big advocate for, is a gift from God. It shouldn't be left on the shelf or buried in the field like a piece of silver. It should be used. That's why I'm a big advocate of using vaccines. I get very frustrated when people try to convince other people not to use vaccines. I think it's no different than teaching people how to take their 3 coins or 5 coins, I can't remember how many they had, and bury, or 10 coins, and bury them in the field, and then thinking they're going to multiply. So I have a lot of confidence. I trust in God. We're going to get through this. And that I think we have to be smart about it. I don't think we have to be fearful about it. Now, if I had done this with you 20 years ago, I would have been very different about it, because I wasn't in that place in my own journey. So I think I have that confidence that we're going to get through this. We're going to solve this problem. We're going to learn from it. We're going to be better. I dealt with the AIDS epidemic for many years, and that was my life. And I used to always try to, and I do believe this, that the men, women, and children that were living with HIV, I used to say, some people misinterpreted it, because I used to say that I felt the men and women and children living with AIDS were the modern day saints. And God put them, allowed them to endure the challenges and suffering that they endured, because they were here to teach the rest of us to get our act together, because we were so preoccupied by whether we had a nice house or a big job or we were famous. And when I saw people my own age back in the 1980s, that I did everything I could as a doctor to try to help their lives, no matter what I did, they died. It was a very humbling time, but it was also a time of awakening, of realizing, what is the purpose of what I'm trying to do? What does really drive me? And I do believe the day that the world listens to the voices of these modern day saints, the AIDS epidemic will be solved. And that's the same way I see this COVID pandemic. It's waking us up. We're not in this alone.
Thank you. Anyone else with another question? No questions, going once. Anyone else? Last chance.
Is it still light outside? I see light behind you. Is that really light?
Yes. Well, it's getting dark, but
It's pitch black where I am.
oh.
You guys are up higher. You're up there, so it's really still light up there.
Well, it's a little bit. It's getting darker though. With
But
each minute.
Dr. Redfield, I can tell you that East Aurora is the most wonderful place on earth. And it just stays light a little while longer for people in East Aurora.
I think it's great to see the sky right now, because I'm seeing pitch black.
Uh-huh. Well, Dr. Redfield, thank you very much for this presentation. You were very informative, and I think you helped us all understand the whole process a little bit better. So I certainly appreciate it. Thank you. And I also want to thank again Mr. Caputo for arranging this event for us. So, and I want to thank all the people who have joined us this evening for the the event. So again, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, and thank everybody who tuned in. What you're doing is, I've said it before, and I'll say it in closing, that I truly believe, as really one of the leading public health figures in the country, if not the world, that the public health interest of children right now, K through 12, is best served by us all working together to see how we can get them back into face-to-face learning. Michael Caputo would say, safely and sensibly. And it's worth the effort to try to figure out how to get that done.
Okay, thank you very much.